Welcome, everyone. My name is Earl Beatty. I'm a senior fellow here at Construx, and I'm excited today to bring you Steve Tockey and a new look of a cone of uncertainty, something he's been doing to help automate the cone of uncertainty, because the cone of uncertainty has been near and dear to our hearts here at Construx for decades. And taking it so it's making more available and more usable to everyone is a great ad. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Earl. So thanks, Earl. Yeah, so let's dive on in here. Now, I do want to reference back to an earlier podcast that Earl and I did 1st of May. It was the Inspect and Adapt episode number 48 on the cone of uncertainty. Hopefully, we'll link this when we publish this out on YouTube. The link will be in the description there, where there was a brief conversation about a tool for computed cone of uncertainty. And the point of this webinar is to fill in that gap, to talk about that tool in detail, show you how you get it, show you how you can use it. Now, whatever screen you're on, I mean, if you're watching this on a tablet, if you're watching this on a smartphone in particular, some of the things might be hard to see, so I would recommend watching this on actually the biggest screen you can find. Okay, so here we go. Come on. So these are my goals today. This is what I hope to accomplish. Just remind you of the cone of uncertainty, what it is, how important it is, some key things you need to know about it, and then to introduce this new free tool that will allow you to compute your organization's cone of uncertainty and then use it to derive rational project commitment ranges. And maybe this doesn't make sense what I'm saying right now, but hopefully by the end, this will all make sense to you. Okay, so the outline, the agenda, the review, what you need to know about the cone of uncertainty, and then we'll dive into the tool demo. Okay, in terms of reviewing the cone of uncertainty, if you've seen this before, fine, but if you haven't seen it before, the idea is that for any estimate, we're trying to estimate doing some work. For any estimate, there's a probability that that estimate will be what actually happens. And so the analogy here, and this is, I'm borrowing this analogy from Earl. He talked about it in that podcast. The analogy is driving from your house to the airport. And so my house is 43 kilometers away, 27 miles away from SeaTac Airport, because I'm in Redmond, Washington. Because my car cannot go infinitely fast, it's going to take a non-zero amount of time to get my car and me from here to the airport. In fact, I looked it up. My engine control unit has a rate limiter that limits the speed of the car to 180 kilometers per hour or 112 miles per hour. And that distance, 43 kilometers over 180 kilometers per hour, means the absolute shortest my car could get from here to the airport is 14 minutes. Now, in order to do that, of course, the roads need to be empty. There's no traffic, there's no construction, there's no police, et cetera, et cetera. And so on this probability density function, hopefully you can see my pointers. I'm pointing to this, what we call the impossible zone. These are outcomes that are just impossible because the car physically doesn't move that fast. At this 14-minute point, it does become at least within the realm of possibility. I mean, again, if the roads are clear, if the weather is perfect, if there's no construction, et cetera, yeah, I could theoretically get there in 14 minutes. Now, more likely 15 minutes, more likely. You work out the math, actually, and the most likely, let me put it this way. It's as likely to take more than 40 minutes as less than 40 minutes based on my history of how many times I've driven to the airport. If I just pay attention to the time for how long it takes, half the time I'm more than 40 minutes, half the time I'm less than 40 minutes. Now, it has in fact taken 3 hours once just because of absolutely horrendous traffic. But that's once in about 25 years. And so as a consultant friend of mine, Myler Page Jones, would say, what this is showing us is that there's There's a limit to how good you can be. There isn't necessarily a limit to how bad you can be. Now, the important point here, though, is that this is not a Gaussian, this is not a normal distribution. The best we can tell is something called a beta distribution that we'll talk about later. It's truncated, it's lopped off on the lower side. Okay. Now, the point here is that, yes, driving a car from here to the airport is actually quite a good analogy for software projects. There's a fixed distance. There's a maximum productivity, fixed amount of work to do. There's a maximum productivity, which means that there's an impossible zone. It's going to take some non-zero amount of time before it even becomes possible. As I said, when we were talking about driving the car, there are external factors, as I was pointing out, weather, construction, how aggressive the police are in enforcing the speed limit, et cetera, et cetera. And the point there is that these are things that are beyond my control. Whereas there are things that are in my control. How well I maintain my car, how aggressively I drive. Do I choose to leave my house during a commute hour, or do I choose to leave my house during a non-commute hour? And what we're showing here is that for software projects, on the left side, I have this set of things which are external factors. I have no control over these, and they throw some amount of uncertainty into the outcome. Whereas on the right side, that right side column are, again, these are things that are under my control, but again, they do affect the outcome in subtle but important ways, okay? And so whether you take the analogy of driving the car or whether you apply it to the actual software project, it's the same fundamental dynamics at work here. And so that probability density function that we were talking about applies in either case. Okay. Now, the point here is that the uncertainty in software projects is actually a measurable phenomenon. We can actually measure it by taking certain data at certain points in the project, recording the data, and then processing the data later. Now, I'm showing you this for a waterfall life cycle. Keep in mind, I can easily do it for an agile development cycle as well. And I'll talk briefly how to do that. It seems to be easier for people to get their mind around the waterfall mode, and we've got more data on that, okay? But basically what we're going to have in waterfall mode is standard reference points, the phases, the milestones. And at every milestone, we're going to estimate. And so for this Framus 4.7 project, we're saying when we got to the point of scope defined, we estimated that this was 7 months worth of work. When we finished the requirements work, we now re-estimated because we knew more about the universe. We're now saying, well, we think it's going to be 11 months worth of work. After having done the design, now we think we can get it done in 10 months. And these are overall estimates at various points in time. Now, the project actually took 10 months to complete. And so we circle back and we divide all of those estimates by the actual outcome. So 10 divided by 7 is 1.43. Now, the meaning of the 1.43 is that means that 7 months estimate at the point of scope defined was an underestimate by 43%. That the 11-month estimate was an overestimate by 9%. The design complete estimate of 10 months was dead on accidentally. The code complete estimate of 9 months was under by 11%. And so what we're going to do is take those relative errors, that the actual divided by the estimate, we're going to take those relative errors and just plot them on a graph. And so hopefully you can see the pointer, but here is the 1.43. Here is the 0.91, here is the 1.0, et cetera, et cetera. And this is all for that one Framus 4.7 project. But see now, if I repeat this for many projects and plot their relative errors, then we should hopefully start to see a pattern up here where at each estimate point, I have the same number of dots. It's just we would expect the dots to be more dispersed earlier in projects because we know less about the universe. The tendency should be for the dots to get closer and closer together as we go through the project. Okay, so extending that, then there is this quote cone of uncertainty concept, uh, which was originally developed apparently by the American Association of Cost Engineers, that's now known as AACE International. They first developed this idea in 1958. Barry Bain published a version of it he called the funnel curve in his 1981 classic book, Software Engineering Economics, using data that came from some DoD contract, software contracts under a Freedom of Information Act, and several large bank projects in Southern California, because he's a university professor at University of Southern California. Okay. And so that was published, and this cone of uncertainty here, as published, has basically persisted, but it's what would I get if I looked at the limits of variation over time of the spread of those dots that I was showing you on the previous slide. Now, what I'm trying to do here, hopefully you can see this, I'm trying to relate that probability density function that we were talking about to the cone of uncertainty picture. And so again, hopefully you can see the pointer here, but the best case is at the lower limit curve. The worst case is at this upper limit curve. And it's as if I'm taking that cone of uncertainty and I'm slicing it vertically, take a vertical slice, and then rotate it and look at the cross section. That's where that distribution sits. And so what the cone of uncertainty is actually telling me is how that distribution changes from not very tall but very wide early to more narrow and taller, because at all points, every vertical slice, the area, the cross section of that slice should have the same area, because we're talking statistically about the same probabilities here. So hopefully that helps you understand what's going on with this cone of uncertainty. And again, if you have any questions, you can toss something into the Q&A, and Earl and I could answer the questions later. Okay, now in terms of what you need to know about the cone of uncertainty, Construx as a company has been involved in cone of uncertainty related work for literally 30 years. This is something that as long as we have been in business, we've been doing things with cone of uncertainty, including gathering data from organizations, and I'll actually show you some. And so based on about 30 years of experience of dealing with it, let's talk about what you need to know. Thing number one, it's real and it's substantial enough to matter. In other words, ignore it at your own peril. It's there, it's big enough, you shouldn't be ignoring it. If you ignore it, it will hurt you. Message number two is incredibly important and incredibly under-recognized, is that the uncertainty varies significantly from one organization to the next. The shape of the cone of uncertainty in any one organization is strongly influenced by how that organization does its software projects. It's not useful to even think about a standard quantified industry-wide cone of uncertainty. So if I go back to that Barry Bain cone with that shape and those numbers and everything, I'm saying just no. It's interesting from an academic get the point across, but to think that that applies to you is totally ridiculous, as you're going to see. And the final point being that you not only can, but you should measure your own cone of uncertainty, and you should use your own cone of uncertainty. And so you need to know how to do that. Let's talk about how to do that, and let's talk about a tool that does allow you to do that. So those are the 3 points that I want to get through in this section. Okay. Now, if you've worked with me before, you'll notice that when I'm teaching a class, quite often I'll say, hey, if you need a little bit of free consulting, fine. I'll just toss in a little bit of free consulting. The idea here is that you get the consulting for free, provided I get to use the data that comes out of the consulting in an anonymous manner. If you want me to keep all of this data private between us, then this is the kind of consulting you have to pay for. So the point is, I'm showing you here is a real cone of uncertainty from a real organization. They're based in Boston, Massachusetts. And under this, I'll help you develop your cone of uncertainty. Here's the data you need. Here's a spreadsheet that computes it. I can show people that cone of uncertainty. I just can't say who it is other than Financial Services, Boston, Massachusetts. Okay, now the point here is, again, real live cone of uncertainty for an organization. If we look at the 10% of the way into the project, the upper bound here, the lower bound here, the mean in the middle here, what this is telling us is that if we were to estimate at 10% of the way into the project that this was a 10-week project, that the reality is the project is as likely to be more than 18 weeks as less than 18 weeks. The true 50-50 probability, the true is likely more than as less than, is 18 weeks, not the 10 weeks that you estimated. And that based on what we have seen, the project could actually take as much as 26 weeks. That would be the upper limit here, and could take as few as 12 and a half weeks. That's the kind of variance that we've seen in the past. Now, by the time we get halfway through the project, we're looking at, if now I think it's a 10-week project, the true 50-50 is more like 11.2 weeks. It could take as much as 14 weeks. It could take as little as 9 weeks based on what we've seen in the past. Okay, so important point, this is a real organization. Now, another real organization, they're in healthcare services in the upper Midwest in the US. Notice what's really unique about this one is that it's not converging. It starts off with a certain width and then it diverges before converging. When we got the data from the organization, plugged it into the tool and saw this, it was like, wait, that's not supposed to happen. And it took about a day. But the guy I was working with at this organization finally realized, he says, Steve, I got it. I know what's happening here. He says the first estimate on the project and the third estimate on the project are done by the tech lead of the project, okay? The second estimate is done by marketing. And so the point here is to say, well, look, marketing's estimate is pretty much crap. Whatever marketing is estimating is a worse estimate than the tech lead's first estimate, and you should probably just ignore marketing's estimate as being irrelevant. Okay, organization number 3. This is a multinational, very large multinational chemical processing company. And so their sort of scoped, defined estimate had rather wide uncertainty. And then they would do some requirements work that would vastly reduce the uncertainty. Then they would do design work. But the curious thing here is that their design work was not really contributing to reducing the uncertainty. They didn't know a whole lot more about what it was going to take the project to get done before having done the design than after having done design. Now, by the time that they completed the code, we have a little bit better idea of what it's going to take to get the project done. After they've completed the testing, they have. Now, what's interesting here is that some uncertainty starts to creep back in, and the issue is that they're in an environment where they have a managed IT environment, and the team that develops the code, they don't do the deployment. They hand it off to the third party, and the third party does the deployment into the managed IT environment. And it's just the uncertainty comes in because of this third party vendor that's doing the deploy that's totally out of their control. So it throws the uncertainty back in. This organization is it's a division in one of several multinational software giants, you would obviously know the name if I told you. Now, the important thing about here is that you see some fairly wide uncertainty up until the third estimate, and then it's incredibly narrow after that. Now, what's happening in this particular organization is that the behavior of the project during the first three estimates is those estimates are against a fixed statement of scope. Look, this is how much work we need you to do. Tell us how long you think it's going to take. And so estimate 1, estimate 2, estimate 3. Now, at the estimate 3 point in their development process, they shift the project from fixed scope to fixed schedule. Essentially, at that 35% of the way into the project point, they're saying, okay, we're going to declare our delivery date to be such and such a date. And from then on, what they're actually doing is managing the scope to meet the delivery date. So the important message here is that this is a view of the schedule uncertainty. And what happened was at that third milestone, the uncertainty didn't go away. It just moved to a different part of the project. It became, now the schedule is certain because we've committed to a particular delivery date, but what we're going to actually deliver becomes uncertain. Okay, and so their fixed scope for the first three estimates, and then their fixed schedule for the remainder of the project. And so you're seeing how the uncertainty goes away from the scope. But if we were doing a scope cone of uncertainty, there would be no uncertainty in scope for the first 35% of the project. Then you would see a wide uncertainty, etc. Okay, and so that's what's going on here. It looks weird because they're running the project in two different modes: fixed scope fixed scope early, fixed schedule late, and they're shifting in the middle of the project. Here's another organization. What do we got here? Some kind of retail sales, some sort of business to consumer kind of sales. And honestly, these people are actually quite bad. So the initial estimate, let's just look at a 35% of the way into the project estimate, kind of just shy of halfway through, that if my estimate was 10 weeks, 35% of the way into the project, the actual 50-50, the actual as likely to be over as to be under was actually double that. In other words, I said it was 10 weeks. It's actually more likely to be 20 weeks. But the worst case, as much as 50 weeks, with a best case of apparently approximately 0. Okay, ain't going to happen, but yeah, work with me on this. Okay, and so what we're saying here is that in this organization, it has been the case where, relatively speaking, somebody had estimated, we're pretty much a third of the way into the project. We think it's going to take 10 weeks, relatively speaking, and it's taken as much as 50 weeks, 50 weeks. So what we thought was 2.5 months worth of work ended up taking a full year. And I don't know if you can see it based on the resolution of your screen, but hopefully up here, there's a massive outlier data point where something that was estimated relatively to take 10 weeks actually took 76 weeks. In other words, I said it was 10 weeks and it actually took 1.5 years. And so that just seems to be some pretty horrendous estimation when it comes down to it. But even worse is this organization where you're seeing, where you're seeing estimates that are a factor of 13 underestimated. We thought it was going to take 10 weeks. It took 130 weeks. Okay. And so while their first estimates are even worse than the previous organization, by the second estimate, they're kind of in the same ballpark in terms of how they're performing. Okay, so again, these are 6 real cones of uncertainty from 6 real organizations. Now, what I want to point out, key observations, notice how each organization's cone of uncertainty was significantly different from the others, okay? That idealized, I should have mentioned that Barry Boehm, I'm going to refer to that as the idealized cone of uncertainty. That idealized one that was published by Barry Boehm was symmetric. It looked the same on the bottom as it was on the top. It's as if you took it and you rotated it this way. But what you notice about the 6 that I showed you from these real organizations is decidedly not symmetric. There's a chronic tendency to underestimate, often by quite a lot. And if you look at the worst case on that idealized cone of uncertainty, if you look at that upper limit curve, what you see is that other upper limit curve on that is actually better than the unbiased, the average cases in 4 of the 6 that I just showed you. So that idealized cone of uncertainty is actually hopelessly optimistic for most software organizations. You would wish that that was your cone of uncertainty. No, your cone of uncertainty is actually much worse than that one. The other message, these 6 do not narrow nearly as quickly as that idealized one. That idealized one started off fairly wide, but then narrowed actually quite quickly. But what we're seeing in reality is that substantial uncertainty remains throughout most of software projects. And finally, hopefully you started to get a hint of this as I was going through, an organization's cone of uncertainty can actually be a useful diagnostic tool. We can explain the shape by factors that were unique to that organization, as in that one software vendor that was operating in fixed scope mode early, switching to fixed schedule mode later. That second organization that was in healthcare management, you were seeing that the marketing second estimate was essentially worthless. It was throwing noise into the system, not reducing uncertainty. And so by looking at the cone of uncertainty, by understanding the shape, you can start to understand what's important in your organization in terms of driving uncertainty away or allowing the uncertainty to remain and certain things about the behavior. So again, the key message, everybody's cone of uncertainty is different because you're building different software in a different way for different customers than everybody else. Then there are going to be different drivers of uncertainty in your organization. Okay, now what I did as an experiment was take everybody's data and throw it into one big bucket and just run it all as one big bucket. And this is what happens when you take all of the data and you throw it in to the same bucket and analyze it. Now, the important thing here is that, look, if a standard industry-wide idealized cone of uncertainty existed, if it existed, we should be seeing it in this much data. This is 133 projects in various organizations. I would think with 133 data points that if there was a standard cone of uncertainty across, we would see it in 133 projects over 6 organizations. We're not seeing it. The data goes wide, narrow, wide, narrow, wide, narrow, wide, narrow. So clearly there is no standard industry-wide cone of uncertainty. It doesn't appear, so it doesn't exist, which leads me to the conclusion that because everybody is different, you need to measure your own, you need to use your own. And so the question then becomes, how do you go about doing it? Okay. And so let's shift over into how do you use the cone of uncertainty. We'll talk about how to measure it a little bit later, but let's talk about how to use it if you've already measured it. But I need to start with a little vocabulary lesson. So when I use the term estimate, what I mean estimate is an analytical prediction by the people that are going to do the work of what they realistically think it's going to take to get the work done. Analytical, this is not fortune cookie. This is not read your horoscope. There's some analysis going on here. Ideally, we would want this estimate to correspond to a 50-50 probability. We are as likely to do better than this as to do worse than this. We could do better, we could do worse, but we are as likely to do better as we are to do worse. And as I said, by analogy, getting from my house to the airport, the 50-50 probability, 40 minutes. The target is a statement of need. It's a statement of desire. It's what the consumer wants it to take. Okay. I need to get to the airport. Hey, Steve, I need you to drive me to the airport in time for I don't know, 3 p.m. flight, whatever. Okay. But that target, what they want, is owned by them. We cannot tell them what their target is. They can't tell us what our estimate is. We can't tell them what the target is. Okay. And the third word here is the idea of a commitment, a pledge to deliver. Preferably, this should be a joint agreement between the producers and the consumers. Practically, it should be a range saying, okay, you want an 80% probability that you're going to make your flight. You want 90% probability. You want 99% probability. You tell me how confident you need to be, and then we'll make a commitment that delivers you that degree of confidence. But necessarily, it can't ever be 100% confident. Okay, so estimate what I think it's realistically going to take, target what you want it to take, the commitment being the agreement, and there is likely to be some negotiation. Hey, your target is unattainable under the current configuration, but tell you what, if you give me some more resources, if you cut some scope, then if you can agree to that, that becomes something that we can both agree to become the commitment. Okay. And so what I'm showing you right now is numeric version of the cone of uncertainty from some organization, from some past set of historical projects. They've run the data, they've computed, and what they're saying is the upper limit, the upper bound curve, the lower bound curve, and then the middle curve, which is measuring systemic bias. Okay. And so what this is telling us is the point of scope defined, they tend to underestimate projects on average by 16%. So if I think my project is 10 weeks, that it's actually likely to be more than as less than 11.6 weeks. Okay, it could take as much as 19 weeks. It could take as little as 4 weeks based on what we've seen in our organization in the past. And so that's the whole idea here. My best estimate, in my heart of hearts, I think 10 weeks, but what I'm going to do is take that 10-week estimate, I'm going to multiply it by the upper limit, the mean, and the lower limit, and that becomes the commitment. Okay. More realistically, it's as likely to take more than 11.6 as less than 11.6, but it could take as little as 4. It could take as much as 19.1 based what we've seen historically in our organization. Therefore, my estimate is the 11.6, but what I'm willing to commit to is between 4 and 19. That's the whole trick here. You want my commitment? Yeah, I'm willing to say between 4 and 19. I'll commit to that. Okay. Now, later on, maybe I'm now estimating 11 weeks, but then we're underestimating on average by 10%. So that'll kick it up to 12.1 weeks. But I'm saying I'm willing to commit now to between 7 and 17 weeks. And this is all just a multiply step. Let's go to the next point. Oh, now I think it's 12 weeks. Okay, well, we're under by 5%, so let's kick that up to 12.6 weeks. But my commitment is 8.8 to 16.3 based on what we have seen in our organization in the past, and then 13 weeks, and then 14 weeks. Okay. Now let's just say that in the end, it actually took 14.4 weeks. And what I'm showing here is the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, actual 14.4. That becomes another block of data that we feed back into the next time we update the cone of uncertainty calculations. So we're using a cone of uncertainty as calculated from previous data, but as we're using it, we're actually picking up more data to use next time we derive a new cone of uncertainty. So we may run some number of projects over a calendar quarter, take the data, update the cone. run another calendar quarter, take the projects, update the cone, publish it, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. The other pattern that I want you to pay attention to is that notice that in all cases, at every point in this project, the estimates were getting, if you will, worse and worse. The project was apparently becoming longer and longer and longer, but my worst case commitment out to the consumers was getting better and better and better. 19 weeks to 17 weeks to 16 weeks to 15 weeks to 15.3 to 15.0. And so in spite of internally, it's becoming a bigger and bigger project. In the end, what my customer is saying is that things are getting better. Oh, we're confident it's no more than 19. We're confident it's no more than 17. It's no more than 16. And finally, at all points in this entire series, the actual outcome of 14.4 was always within the committed range at that point. Okay. And so it really is just an exercise in mathematics of saying, okay, what am I estimating at this point? What spread do I need to apply in based on where I am in my organization's cone? Multiply, multiply, multiply. That's what I'm willing to commit to based on our organization's past performance. Okay. So now we're ready to go into the demonstration of the tool. Okay. I'm going to start off with a little caveat here. The outputs that are coming out of the tool are not necessarily perfectly theoretically correct numbers. There's some assumptions built in, there's some shortcuts, there's some approximations. For example, the tool will do Gaussian normal probability distributions for compatibility with the spreadsheets and for other reasons, but we know that that's not correct, and I'll talk about that in more detail later. There's something called an asymmetric mode, which approximates what we believe to be a beta distribution, but it's an approximation. It's not dead on, but that's okay. There's a lot of other noise in the system anyway. We're doing some combining of allowances and contingencies using the square root of the sum of the squares formula, what some people will call root mean squared, which assumes that everything going in is independent, which is not necessarily true. It also assumes that everything going in is 50-50, as likely to do better as to do worse. And we're very definitely dealing with some things that are not 50-50. Sometimes they're 80-20, sometimes they're 90-10. And so again, the numbers that are coming out are not absolute theoretically perfectly correct, but they are at least rational approximations of reality and should therefore be usable. Not perfect, but good enough to be usable. Okay, now the tool itself and some associated resources are available. This is a rather cryptic Dropbox URL. It or a tiny URL version of it will be in the description when this video goes out on YouTube. Other than that, Earl should have pasted that URL into the chat. And so you can just copy it out of there and you can go get things right now. You don't have to wait until the video gets posted. But at that Dropbox URL, you will find the tool itself. It's a Java archive named COU.jar. There's a user's guide for how to use the tool, COU Estimator User's Guide.pdf. There is some sample data. You will find the 6 organizations. There's also some data there that's synthetic manufactured data that we use for testing. There's an XLS spreadsheet tool helper that I'll talk about in a while. And then there's a PDF of the slides that we're using here. So all of that is available at that URL. You can go grab it, use it, and fine. Okay. So I just quickly want to say that, yeah, for many, many years, I mean, I first built a spreadsheet to do this, I'm thinking 25 years ago, to do the calculations. But that tool, the Excel spreadsheet tool, if you happen to see it or even used it, it would only support waterfall life cycles. It only did Gaussian standard deviations, which I refer to as symmetrical mode, and it wouldn't allow me to automate the project commitment calculations like I just walked through. And the point of this tool is that it does support all different life cycles, including Agile. It does the symmetrical Gaussian, but then it approximates the beta using a technique that we'll look at and that I'm calling, quote, asymmetrical, and it does the commitment calculations. Okay. And so again, beta distribution, it's not symmetrical like a normal Gaussian. And so the idea here is that the frequency of overestimation, we estimated more than what it actually took us. The frequency of overestimation is less, and the amount of overestimation is less. In other words, we tend to underestimate more often and by a larger amount. And that's reflected in this beta distribution. So the point then becomes, if I just do a single standard deviation, it's skewed. And let's just say for a certain organization at a certain particular point in time that the standard deviation comes out 0.42. That if I took a 10-week estimate, I would say that because it's one standard deviation, plus and minus, there's a 68% chance that the project mathematically, if it really was a Gaussian normal distribution, that I would be willing to commit to between 5.8 and 14.2 weeks. I'm just taking that standard deviation of 0.42, multiplying it by 10 and adding it and subtracting it from my 10-week estimate to get the range. Okay, but the point here is, in fact, we're highly unlikely to ever get close to 5.8. Okay, we're overly optimistic on the overestimate side, and we're not pessimistic enough on the underestimate side. In fact, we could easily do worse than 14.2 weeks. And so the how to get around that, the decision was, tell you what, let's start with this beta distribution, and I'm talking about this asymmetric mode that you're going to see demoed in the tool. But let's start with that distribution. Now, what we'll do is we'll ignore all the overestimates for a moment. Let's just take the underestimates and then we'll mirror image them. Take the underestimates, mirror image them, and then we'll do the standard deviation across that whole range. And let's say that that gives us a standard deviation of 0.78. Okay, which is much bigger than the 0.42 that we were getting if we tried to do the just off the shelf standard deviation. But we're going to play the same game on the overestimates. We're just going to take the overestimates, inverse them, and then run a standard deviation on that. And let's say we get 0.31. So the point then becomes is that from that mean point, from that average point, from that unbiased point, we're going to subtract 0.31 standard deviation. Standard deviation is 0.31. We're going to use that on the overestimate side, and we're going to use a different standard deviation on the underestimate side. Okay. And so instead of what I told you before, that 10-week estimate, 68% chance of being between 5.8 and 14.2. No, what we're going to do is say now, that 10-week estimate is a 68% chance of being between 6.9 and 17.8 weeks. That's this asymmetrical mode. We're using different standard deviations on either side of the mean. And the tool will support the symmetrical mode. It will support the asymmetrical mode, whereas the spreadsheets only did things symmetrically. Okay, so let me jump over into the actual starting, demo the tool. You know where you can get it. Just go to that URL, get the jar file, double click on it, and I'll show you how you can then choose which data you're going to use. And let me just give you a quick overview of the windows. And so give me a quick moment here. Dropbox, cone of uncertainty tool. Here you are. Okay. Cone of uncertainty jar, pardon me, double click, boom, tool comes up. Cool. Okay. Cone of uncertainty sample data, double click. Here's a bunch of historical data. I'm just going to use CTM schedule and open. Boom. Okay, so here is the tool. Now the idea is here is the computed cone of uncertainty from the data that I gave it. And here is a sort of driver window, okay? And so I'm seeing what the cone of uncertainty is over here on the left side, and I have the ability to manipulate things and run my estimates over here on the right side. So I want to start off initially. So I've demoed launching the tool. I've demoed choosing the historical data. I've talked about the two windows, the cone of uncertainty viewer, and then the estimator tool, which allows me to set some configuration on the cone of uncertainty. There's a zone that allows me to put in project estimates, and then I'll demo the commitment range outputs in just a moment. Okay. Yes. Okay. But the next thing we need to do is talk about the cone of uncertainty configuration. What I'm showing you on the slide is the range for that input. What is the input? What are the ranges for the inputs? And what's the default input? So on this page, many of them are yes, no, not all of them are, and what the defaults are. But what you're seeing over here, okay. So how confident does the decision maker need to be? I've got it defaulting to 80%. Okay, so that means that 1 in 5 times we run a project and make a commitment that the actual outcome is outside of the commitment that we said we made. 1 in 5 projects. And if they're happy with that, well, let's just use 80% confidence. If they need it 1 in 10, then we need to change the percent confidence to 90. Now notice what that does is it widens out the cone. Okay, because it's using the standard deviations, it's using some n multiplier standard deviations. Bottom line, statisticians use something called a letter Z or Z table that says if this is the confidence you want, use this many standard deviations. That table is built into the tool. So notice right up here, 90% confidence means 1.645 standard deviations. Okay, so it automatically adjusts the width of the cone to set it to the degree of confidence that you input here. Now, the next input here, symmetrical, asymmetrical. It's in asymmetrical mode right now because that's the default. So it's using different standard deviations above the mean and below the mean. If I click that off, now it's in symmetrical mode. Now it's just done the standard deviation across the entire range and then added that n standard deviations to get the upper and subtracted the n standard deviations to get the lower. So it's using the same width above and below the mean, which is why it's called symmetrical. But again, when we go to asymmetrical, it's using above that mean as a separate standard deviation from below that mean. Okay, so hopefully everybody's got that. Non-linear interpolation. There are some cases that there's a curve fitting algorithm for what value do I use when I'm between the points that I've observed. Because we need to be able to do the calculations for any estimate at any point, even though we don't have data at that point. There are cases where the curve fitting algorithm does some weird things. And so you may want to throw it into linear interpolation. So it just throws everything on a straight line, which in some cases makes more sense. Okay. Hopefully you'll see it here, but display historical data points. All those little X's, those were the actual data which fed into the computations, and I can turn them off if I decide I want to turn them off. Now, the trick to making this work across all life cycles is that I'm not requiring estimates to be made at a certain point, a milestone. You can have estimates made at any point in the project. There's an automatic, if you will, clustering algorithm that says for data points that are about the same point in time, let's put them into groups. And okay, but if you don't have enough data, then what's going to happen here is that you have to manually control the clustering. Take these data points and put them into this block, and take those data points and put them into that block. And this basically says how many blocks you have here. And so I'm just cutting the X coordinate into different amounts, different block sizes, which leads to different data points. And again, this is explained in the manual, and you can play around with it. Okay, so let me go back here. That's fine. Okay, so that's how you can configure your cone of uncertainty. Well, how confident do I need to be? Do I want to go asymmetric? Do I want to go symmetrical, et cetera, et cetera? In terms of now actually doing an estimate to a commitment, you tell it what your overall estimate is. It's going to default to 0. You choose the units. That doesn't say the units. You want to do weeks, months, years, whatever. If you use 1.0, this is how you can see what the actual cone of uncertainty values are. And then this at estimated percent completion input is saying where in the X dimension we are. Where do we think we are in the project? Then the estimate results, and I'll show you that as a moment. And then there's this apply historical estimate bias factor. And so let me explain here. So let's just say, for sake of argument here, that we're 10% of the way into the project. And let's just say, for sake of argument here, that we think this is a 20-week project at this point in time. Okay. Now, I said I think it's as likely to be more than 20 as less than 20. But the important thing here is, in reality, because of the amount of bias in this organization, the true 50-50 point is more like 35 weeks. I thought 20, but we tend to underestimate by a lot. And so the actual is likely better than as worse than is this 35.54 being reported here. Now, it could be as much as 45, and it could be as little as 9.8. Oh, and by the way, that's a 90% confidence. If I don't need 90% confidence, I want to back it off to 80%. Then you see my commitment is now between 15 and 43. If I'm happy with a 70% confidence, now we're between 19 and about 42, okay? And so by basically just saying, where am I in the project? Let's run a mid project, 50%. Oh, I think it's 20 weeks at the 50% point, and I want to be 80% confident. Then I'd say, okay, well, it's more likely, truly is likely more than is less than 22 and a half, but it's no less than 18, no more than 29, based on the data that we've got. Okay. And okay, so that's what gives me the basic ability to do estimation. Now, the other thing here is, as I said, this apply historical estimate bias factor, that if we just continue to run projects the way we've always run projects, at this point in time, we are underestimating by a certain amount. Now, suppose that I change how I'm estimating, and I believe that this change in how I'm estimating does in fact get rid of the bias. Okay. And so maybe my true estimate now really is the 22.43. But if I put in the 22.43 here, it's like, oops, it tries to unbias that. Oh, but that's not what I want. I don't want it to do the unbiasing. I'm doing the unbiasing. So if I put in 22.4, unchecked the apply, then the worst case, best case that I'm getting here, 18 to 29, should be the same as if I just put in the 20 and had it apply, and there we go, 18 to 29. Okay, so this basically allows me to either put in normal estimates, or if I change how I'm doing estimates and I've unbiased them, then I don't have to rebias them in order to make the tool. You can just switch it on and off. Okay. We're not quite done yet. The next thing that we have to cover here, and we can do this fairly quickly, is that I'm only looking at uncertainty. I also want to consider risks and assets. Now, uncertainty applies to all projects in the organization. It's peanut butter, spread it across. Merely because it's a project in my organization, it's subject to the generic uncertainty that always is there. We need to allow for that. Okay. Risk applies only to a specific project. Okay. Maybe I have a new technology that no other project in the organization have. Maybe I have a difficult to achieve performance requirement. Maybe I have unusual complexity in a particular dimension. Maybe. An asset is an inverse risk. And a risk is a headwind, something that's working against me. An asset is something that's working in my favor. Maybe we've done things like this before. We can get better than normal reuse because we can pile onto some stuff that's already been built that we don't usually be able to do. Maybe I'm unusually simplistic in this area. Maybe I can hire in somebody who's getting let off a other project that if they finish on time, I can bring them over to my project and get a gain out of them. And so the idea here is there's this companion spreadsheet where I can type in the name of the project. I can say when I last updated the list, but I can say, what is the risk? How likely is it that it hits me? If it hits me, by how much is it going to hit me? Keeping in mind that the units here have to be the same units that I'm using in the estimate. Okay. But let's just say there are 4 risks with these probabilities and these severities, that if it's a 50% probability of a 4-unit severity, that the exposure, the expected value is 2 units. If it's 40% of 2, it's blah, blah, blah. Okay. What I really need to do is pay attention to this sum and this variance down here, the sum and the variance. This is a helper spreadsheet that I copy those numbers, plug them into the tool, as I'll show you in a moment. The same idea on the asset side. Here's my asset. Here's how likely I am to be able to take advantage of it. If I do, I am able to take advantage, this is how much I get out of it. Here's the sum. Here's the variance. Okay. So the idea here is that if I want to incorporate risk and assets, I say my risk contingency sum was 5.02 and my risk contingency variance was 2.72, just copied over from the spreadsheet. And my asset contingency sum was 1.9 and my asset contingency variance was 1.2. Now you see that I thought it was going to be a 20-week project. Again, at this 50% point, I thought it was as likely to be more than 20 as less than 20. It's actually as likely to be more than 25 as less than 25. No earlier than 21, no later than 33. Okay, so with an 80% confidence, you want 80% confidence, I'm going to tell you that based on my estimate, those risks, those assets, that it's as likely to be more than 25 as less than 25, and I'm 80% confident that it'll be between 21 and 33. There was the spreadsheet tool, plug it all in. Okay, so the proverbial bottom line, given that you have accurate data, that the data that you're using, the historical project estimate performance data is representative data from your organization, given that you've configured the cone of uncertainty with the percent confidence and symmetrical, asymmetrical, and all of that kind of stuff, and given that the estimate inputs of overall at what point you are in the project, and if you're doing risks and assets, assuming that all that is reasonable, then it should also be reasonable to expect that what it reported as the quote computed estimate is the true 50-50, as likely to do better than as worse than, and that the best case and the worst case are telling you what the reasonable commitment range is. So this project under these conditions should be able to make an 80% commitment So a 4 in 5 chance that by the end of the project, the actual outcome will be between 27 units and 48 units, whatever the units are, that it would be reasonable to make that kind of commitment to the business. That's where it is. Okay. So the cone of uncertainty is real. It's too significant to ignore. It varies widely from one organization to the next. You can measure, you should measure, you should use your own cone of uncertainty. And here is this brand new free tool that allows you to automate all of this. It's much more powerful than the existing spreadsheets because of that clustering that I talked about, that it will allow data to be gathered at any point in projects. It converts percent confidence to end standard deviations, the symmetrical and asymmetrical, the approximating the beta, the linear, nonlinear interpolation. These are all things that the spreadsheets never did, and the output being a rational commitment range that we should go to the business and say, look, this is what we're really talking about. Now, oh, by the way, I did gloss over it. Sorry. What do we do in Agile projects? Well, Agile project, in terms of the data that goes into the cone of uncertainty, the idea here is that if I'm running the project in fixed scope, in other words, a minimally marketable feature set, minimum viable project, that's going to take me some number of sprints to release, then my estimation data is how many sprints do I think it's going to take? Maybe I think it's going to take 4 sprints, but then I do a sprint and say, no, it's going to take 5 sprints. And then I do another sprint and say, no, I think I'm back to 4 sprints. That my historical data was how many sprints did I think it was going to take me, and how many did it actually take me? Now, on the other hand, if you're working your Agile project in a fixed delivery date, look, you got 10 sprints, build whatever you can in those 10 sprints and deliver it. The idea here is that the estimates are in terms of story points. We think we can deliver X number of story points. And then as we're progressing through the project, we're updating how many story points we think we're going to be able to deliver. And that's what's going into the kind of uncertainty calculations. And then what's coming out of is, again, the same idea. I'm halfway through this release of N sprints, and this release of N sprints. I think I'm going to deliver X story points, but it could be as much as, it could be as little as, and we're just using units of story points rather than units of weeks or sprints or something like that. So let me turn it back over to Earl now to start looking at questions that may have come in.
Well, Steve, that was a great presentation. Really, thank you for that. It shows you have a lot of expertise in this area. That's pretty awesome. We did have a few questions come in. I answered a couple of them, but I think there's a couple more queuing up. And I think you mentioned one at the end here, is that all through the presentation, you were focusing on time as the x-axis. But when you have sort of a fixed budget, right, and you sort of have it, and we're about to decide the idea of design to cost or dynamic design to cost, would that work well for that kind of situation as well?
It can work, but keep in mind that the data that you're feeding in for the calculations has to be under the same mode. Okay. So we didn't talk about what data needs to go in very much detail, but let me just point out the data that goes in needs to be some measure of, at some point in time, I estimated, and this, when did I estimate
units?
What in some unit, what did I estimate and what actually happened in the end?
Yeah.
And those units,
so if I'm
could
doing
be
design costs, it's going to be some measure of scope or something like that. It's going to be my unit if the budget is fixed. It's usually going to, scope's going to vary, maybe schedule, but usually scope.
Well, okay, so if I'm doing a fixed budget project, then I'm not doing things over time. I'm doing things over money. Okay. And so when I have spent this much money, I thought I was going to get this much amount of work done. After having spent that varies. Amount of money, I think I'm going to get this amount of work done. At that amount of money spent, and how much did I actually get work done when I spent all the money? But my point here is that if you have projects running in that mode, that you want data from that mode. Okay. I'm not sure, this is a research question, whether it makes sense to combine data for projects that are running in fixed budget against projects that are running against fixed scope. Do I want to put all the fixed scope projects in one cone of uncertainty, put all the fixed budget projects in another cone of uncertainty, and see if that gives me two different cones of uncertainty? Or does it not hurt me to combine everything? Does it change the uncertainty picture depending on what mode the project is in?
Another question that came in was about trying to estimate wicked problems. It's something you've never done before, something that's completely new. You have no idea whatsoever. I responded to them thinking, I'm assuming this cone is for things that are reasonably estimable and that you can estimate, right? It's not, wow,
Right.
we've been making shoes for 20 years. All of a sudden we're building a rocket ship.
Right.
We have
Exactly.
no history of
Exactly.
ever done that.
Yeah. So,
Right.
I mean, for things that, assuming agile, for things that are likely going to take more than one sprint anyway, we're dealing with things at a release level. Look, we could have an entirely different conversation about if all you're doing is sprints and you're releasing every sprint, the cone of uncertainty is still there. It just gets manifested in a different way. And so if you're really in an environment where we're always single sprint release, single sprint release, single sprint release, different data, different computations, same net effect. Here we're dealing with things that are intended to be multiple sprints over a fairly long, a reasonably well understood amount of time. Yeah.
And I make the argument, and maybe you can want to comment, is that when you're in pure research, if you're truly in research,
Right.
You don't estimate research, you decide investment blocks. And after I invest this much time and learned what I learned, then I either have something I can estimate because I've learned enough, or I decide to make another investment block, or I decide that what I've learned is I should not invest in this anymore. I should go do something else.
Totally, absolutely 100% agree with that. Yeah. I mean, I used to joke that for some projects, it's like they want to, hey, why don't you schedule a cure for cancer next Thursday? That would be really convenient.
Yeah.
Well, if I could,
Right.
I would, but I can't. So, yeah.
Can your tool use more standardized functional size units like cosmic function points, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Right, because you're kind of unit agnostic as long as you keep the same unit. Is that correct?
Well, let me put it this way. If I'm doing things in size, then I would want a cone of uncertainty for size. And the size can be in any units. Cosmic, function points, story points. It will normalize. The underlying computations normalize so that this project could have been in story points, that could have been in function points. So it all gets normalized away under the covers. But as I was saying, that a cone of uncertainty for projects that I run in size mode versus a different cone of uncertainty for projects that I run in schedule mode, because this is time as the measure, not size as the measure. And that I'm not willing to say that I can intermix size measurements with time measurements and get the same answer. So what I would suggest to start with, all of my size measurements, size-based projects, my time-based projects, run them independently, see the cone of uncertainty that comes out, and see if there's any different. I mean, literally run one set, run the other set, combine them, because it's really easy to combine the data. Just cut that, paste that, boom, and then see how different the time set, the size set, and the combined set. See what the cone of uncertainty looks like when you run the data sliced and diced different ways. And if it doesn't matter, then throw it into all one set. I'm just not willing to say that that's a wise thing to do to start with.
For those organizations that aren't being allowed to give a range, first of all, bad on them, but they're not giving range. Could you say, given and say you put in 80% confidence in your tool, then instead of saying my 80% confidence is this range, could you say that I'm 80% confidence on or before and just use the top end of the range?
Right. Yeah. Okay. And so that again points out this difference between the estimate and the commitment. Okay. And so if you're only allowed 1 point, then it should be this worst case point. Okay. I'm saying 80% probability it won't be any more than 19 weeks. 80% probability won't be any more than 17 weeks. They're typically going to be happy because they're going to see that decrease. Now, I skipped over it, sorry, but the key important point here is to manage the project to the 50-50. I'm managing it as if it's a 12-week project. I'm managing it as if it's a 13-week project. I'm managing it as if it's a 14-week project, but I'm reporting out to the stakeholders against the worst case commitment. Okay. Because if you manage the project to the worst case, you're going to get the worst case. That's Parkinson's law. Yeah. So manage to the P50, manage to the 50-50, but report status against that worst case. Yes.
I'm one of the lucky few that has a estimation tool, a slim product or something like that. And it cranks out its uncertainty range. Should I take it would be better for me to take the 50-50 from that tool and put it into your uncertainty tool, or are those uncertainty tools probably reasonably good already for me if I put in historical data?
Well, I would want to understand how it's doing its uncertainty calculations. Okay, because I have seen tools, not necessarily that one in particular, but I have seen tools that purport to deal with uncertainty, and the uncertainty data that they're using is this data. They've essentially programmed this cone of uncertainty, which, as I said, is totally unrealistic. For most organizations, this ain't it. And so if it really is doing uncertainty calculations based on historical data that you've really put in, then fine. I think it might be interesting to take the data, plug it into this tool, and see how this tool compares to what they're saying the uncertainty is. And if they're in the same ballpark, then fine, just use what the tool says. But if what this tool is saying is different than what your tool is saying, I would want to understand why it's telling you different, because it could be basing its calculations on a totally different hardwired cone of uncertainty that has nothing to do with your organization.
In your looking at those 118 projects, have you seen any kind of relationship between size and effort that thing and their functional size, how big they were? It's like twice as big projects tend to be underestimated by a larger factor than smaller projects tend to be underestimated. Any kind of relationship like that?
No, I don't have the data to say that, but I will say that the shape of the cone of uncertainty is actually massively sensitive to the process that is being used.
Yeah.
I mean, here I can say that this organization is getting a lot of value out of doing requirements work the way that they're doing requirements work. What I can say is that the way that they're doing design work is of literally no value. They might as well not do design, because they're no more certain about what they're building after they've done the design than before they did the design.
Right.
So whatever they're doing in design is really not helping them answer the question, what are we building?
Which is a really interesting thing to think about. Steve can be reached at Steve Tockey at Construx.com. The Steve.Tockey at Construx.com.
Or just Steve T at Construx.com.
Or Steve T if you want it shorter. Or you can reach us at hello at Construx.com. You have different questions or comments that you want to do. Thank you all. And I hopefully that we'll hear from you, and you can download that tool again at the URL in the link. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Okay, thank you, everyone.